The hours between midnight and dawn were the longest of Callan's life since leaving the service. He moved through the cabin in darkness, his rifle always within reach, while Smoke maintained a vigilant patrol from window to window. The dog's ears swiveled, constantly tracking sounds that Callan's duller human hearing could not detect. Outside, the blizzard hammered against the log walls with relentless fury, and somewhere in that white chaos men waited for their moment. At 3 in the morning, Smoke went rigid at the eastern window, a low, warning growl building in his chest. Callan moved beside him and peered out through a gap in the boards he had nailed over the glass. Through the driving snow, he caught the faint glow of headlights, multiple vehicles, their engines rumbling like distant thunder. They were not leaving. They were reinforcing. Callan's mind raced through the tactical situation. He was one man with limited ammunition, no communication, and no extraction plan. The storm would last at least another 12 hours, according to the weather radio. He could hold the cabin maybe, but holding was not winning. Eventually, they would simply wait him out or burn him out or find some other method that his lone rifle could not counter. He needed to change the equation. Moving quickly, Callan gathered the ammunition box, the notebooks, and the USB drive. He wrapped them in a waterproof tarp and secured the bundle with duct tape. Then he moved to the hearth where the fire had burned down to red embers. The cavity beneath the hearthstone was still open, dark and waiting. He lowered the bundle into it, positioned it carefully, then began the laborious process of sliding the heavy slate slab back into position. Smoke watched him work, understanding that something important was happening, even if the specifics were beyond canine comprehension. When the stone was finally back in place, Callan kicked dirt and ash across the seam, disguising the edges. If they searched, they would find an empty cabin with nothing to explain why he had refused $150,000. The evidence would survive even if he did not. But survival was still the primary objective. Callan was not ready to tie in this forgotten cabin for a story that was not his own. He had made a promise to Elias Harding's ghost, whether he intended to or not, when he opened those notebooks. But he had also made a promise to Ellen in those final days before the cancer took her, that he would not give up, that he would find a way to keep living. He owed her that much. The attack came at 4:30 in the morning, in the dead hour, when human alertness is at its lowest. Callan had anticipated this. He was sitting in darkness with his back against the stone wall when he heard the telltale sound of breaking glass from the cabin's single back window. Smoke barked once, sharp and commanding. Callan was already moving. A glass bottle with a flaming rag stuffed in its neck arced through the broken window and shattered on the wooden floor. Liquid fire spread instantly, the acrid smell of gasoline filling the small space. The flames licked hungrily at the old dry wood, finding purchase and growing with terrifying speed. A second bottle followed, then a third. Within seconds, the back half of the cabin was engulfed. They were not trying to capture him anymore. They were trying to erase him. Callan grabbed his coat and the canvas bag he had pre-packed with essentials. He snapped a lead onto Smoke's collar, something he almost never did, but he needed the dog close and under control. The heat was already intense, the smoke thick and choking. The front door was the obvious exit, which meant it was the most dangerous. They would be waiting there ready to cut him down the moment he appeared. But the cabin offered only two choices, burn or run. Callan chose a third option. He moved to the front window, the one facing the clearing, and fired 3 rapid shots through it, shattering the remaining glass and splintering the frame. Then he grabbed the camping lantern and hurled it through the opening as hard as he could. It tumbled through the air, still lit, drawing the eye. In that moment of distraction, Callan kicked open the front door and dove left, rolling behind the woodpile on the porch. Smoke was with him, pressed low against the logs. Gunfire erupted from the tree-lined muzzle flashes, bright in the darkness, but the shots were aimed at where the lantern had landed, at where any sane person would have run. Callan did not return fire. He stayed low and moved along the porch, putting the bulk of the burning cabin between himself and the shooters. The smoke was his ally now, thick and black, obscuring everything. He reached the corner of the cabin and dropped into the deep snow, Smoke beside him. The cold was shocking after the heat of the fire, but it cleared his head. He low-crawled away from the cabin, moving toward the tree line on the north side, the side where no vehicles had approached. Smoke understood immediately, matching Callan's movements, his gray coat nearly invisible against the snow. Behind them, the cabin roared like a living thing, flames shooting through the collapsed roof. Callan heard voices shouting, confusion and anger mixing. They had lost track of him in the chaos. He reached the trees and allowed himself one look back. 6 men were visible now in the firelight, dark figures against the orange glow. They were sweeping the clearing with flashlights, searching the snow for tracks. It would not take them long to find the trail he had left. Callan moved deeper into the forest following a game trail that led uphill. The storm was still raging, the wind strong enough to erase his tracks almost as fast as he made them. Not fast enough, but it would help. Smoke stayed at his heel, trusting completely. After 20 minutes of hard climbing through knee-deep snow, Callan found what he was looking for. A rocky outcrop that formed a shallow cave just deep enough to provide shelter from the wind. He crawled inside, pulling Smoke in beside him. The dog's body was warm against his side, both of them breathing hard. From this vantage point, Callan could see down into the valley. The cabin was fully engulfed now, a pillar of fire against the darkness. The storm was beginning to ease slightly, the snow thinning. In another hour, dawn would come. He could also see the men below, 6 of them gathered around 2 trucks. They were conferring, gesturing toward the forest, hunting him. Callan's phone was in his coat pocket. He pulled it out, knowing it was futile, but checking anyway. Still no signal. The storm in the mountains conspired to keep him isolated. But isolation could be a weapon, too. He settled in to wait, conserving his energy, while smoke curled against him, and finally allowed himself to rest. The dog had earned it. He had warned Callan of the first intruder, had disabled the second, had stayed calm through fire and gunfire. Whatever happened next, Callan knew he would not have survived this long without the animal at his side. Sleep was impossible, but Callan entered a state of tactical rest, his body still, but his mind alert. He watched the valley as the sky slowly lightened from black to gray. The men below gave up their search around 6:30, climbing back into their trucks and driving away. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only a blackened skeleton of logs in the stone chimney standing like a tombstone. Everything Callan owned in the world, except what he carried on his back, was ash. But the evidence was safe. The stone hearth had survived. Harding's story was still intact, waiting to be told. At 7:15, as the sun finally broke through the clouds, Callan heard a new sound. Not trucks this time, but something else. Something that made his heart rate spike with a mixture of hope and dread. Helicopters. 2 of them coming in low and fast from the east. As they drew closer, Callan could make out markings. One was Montana State Police. The other was unmarked, black and sleek, the profile of a federal aircraft. They circled the smoking ruins of the cabin once, then landed in the clearing. Doors opened and men emerged, moving with the purposeful efficiency of trained operators. Tactical gear, but not the cheap costume variety that the intruders had worn. These were professionals. Callan stayed hidden, watching. He had learned long ago that the arrival of official help did not always mean safety. He needed to understand the situation before revealing himself. A woman emerged from the black helicopter, tall and authoritative, in an FBI windbreaker. She surveyed the scene, spoke into a radio, then began directing her team to search the perimeter. They moved in an organized pattern, professionals doing professional work. Callan's radio, which he had kept on low volume, suddenly crackled to life. Callan Cross, this is Special Agent Kate Sullivan, FBI. If you can hear this transmission, please respond. You are not in danger from us. I repeat, you are not in danger from federal agents. We received your message via Ryan Baker. We are here to help. Callan exhaled slowly. Ryan had come through. Somehow, despite the lack of communication, despite the storm and the isolation, the message had gotten out. He keyed the radio. Agent Sullivan, this is Callan Cross. I am approximately 400 meters northwest of the cabin location, elevated position in the rocks. I am armed. I have 1 dog with me, approaching your position now. He stood slowly, making himself visible against the white background. Smoke stood with him, alert but not aggressive. Below, half a dozen weapons swung in his direction, then lowered as Sullivan raised her hand. Stand down. That is our witness. Callan made his way down the slope, moving carefully in the deep snow. Smoke stayed close to his eyes on the strangers below. As they reached the clearing, Sullivan walked forward to meet them. She was maybe 45, with sharp eyes and the weathered look of someone who spent more time in the field than behind a desk. Mr. Cross. She extended her hand, and Callan shook it. Her grip was firm. Hell of a night you had. Hell of a 15 years Elias Harding had. Sullivan's expression tightened with something that might have been respect or might have been guilt. We know what happened to him, and we know we should have been here sooner. That ends today. She gestured toward the ruins of the cabin, the evidence. Ryan Baker said you had extensive documentation. Please tell me it was not in there. Callan allowed himself a small smile. The hearth, under the center stone. Everything is there. Harding sealed it, and I resealed it last night before they came. Sullivan spoke into her radio, directing her team to the fireplace. Then she turned back to Callan. We need your statement. Everything that happened since you bought this property. But first, medical. You have been exposed to smoke inhalation and sub-freezing temperatures for hours. I am fine. With respect, Mr. Cross, you are not fine. You are running on adrenaline and stubbornness. Let my medic check you out while we secure the scene. It was not really a request. Callan allowed himself to be led to one of the helicopters where a paramedic examined him with brisk efficiency. Minor frostbite on 2 fingers. Smoke inhalation, not severe, but worth monitoring. Dehydration, exhaustion. Nothing that would kill him, but nothing comfortable either. While he was being treated, Callan watched the FBI team work. They photographed everything, collected samples from the burn structure, and carefully excavated the hearth. When they pulled out the waterproof bundle intact and undamaged, Sullivan's face showed visible relief. She brought it over to where Callan sat wrapped in a thermal blanket. This is exactly what we need. Between what you have here and what Baker sent us digitally, we have enough to bring charges against Cordell, Sheriff Thorne, and possibly Senator Wolf. Possibly. Sullivan's mouth tightened. Wolf is careful. His name is on emails, but the language is always vague, always deniable. We will need testimony from Cordell or Thorne to directly implicate him. That means leverage. As if summoned by the mention of his name, the sound of vehicles approaching echoed across the valley. 3 SUVs, black and official-looking, accompanied by 2 county sheriff's cruisers. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, and Callan felt tension ripple through the FBI agents. Hands moved closer to weapons. The lead SUV's door opened, and Silas Cordell stepped out. He was flanked by 2 men in expensive suits, clearly attorneys. Behind him, Sheriff Lucas Thorne emerged from one of the cruisers, his face a mask of professional concern. Sullivan walked forward to intercept them, her badge held high. "This is a federal crime scene. You need to stay back." Cordell's voice carried clearly across the snow. "I am here as a concerned citizen, Agent Sullivan. I own property adjacent to this parcel, and I was informed of a fire. I came to offer assistance." His eyes found Callan, and something cold flickered in their depths. Then his gaze moved to the FBI agents excavating the hearth, and Callan saw the exact moment when Cordell understood that he had lost. The color drained from Cordell's face. His lawyers were already moving closer, whispering urgently. Sheriff Thorne had gone very still, his hand resting on his sidearm in a way that made every federal agent tense. Sullivan's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Silas Cordell, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, environmental terrorism, and obstruction of justice. Sheriff Lucas Thorne, you are under arrest as an accessory to murder and abuse of office." The lawyers erupted in protest, but Sullivan ignored them. Her agents moved forward with handcuffs. Cordell stood frozen, his mind still trying to process how 15 years of careful control had unraveled in a single night. Thorne was the one who broke. His hand moved toward his weapon, and for one terrible second, Callan thought the man was going to make a suicidal play. But Smoke was faster. The dog, who had been sitting quietly at Callan's side, launched himself forward with the speed that only working dogs possess. He did not bite. He simply placed himself between Thorne and the FBI agents, his body low and ready, a growl that sounded like distant thunder rumbling from his chest. The message was clear. Make that move and face the consequences. Thorne's hand dropped away from his weapon. The fight went out of him all at once, his shoulders sagging. "I did it for my son. He needed surgery. $300,000. I could not let him die." His voice was hoarse, broken. Sullivan nodded to her agents, and they moved in with handcuffs. As they led Thorne away, he looked at Callan with eyes that held a complicated mixture of shame and defiance. "You do not understand what it is like to watch your child suffer and not be able to help." Callan thought of Ellen, of the medical bills that had consumed their savings, of the choices that desperation forced on good people. But he also thought of Elias Harding, who had died alone in a ditch because he tried to tell the truth. "I understand that you had a choice. You chose wrong." Thorne said nothing more as they put him in the back of a federal vehicle. Cordell was less compliant. He stood rigid as they cuffed him, his lawyers shouting about due process and illegal detention. But Sullivan was unimpressed. "Your rights are being respected, Mr. Cordell. You will have access to counsel. You will have your day in court. But you will have it from a jail cell." As they led him away, Cordell turned back toward Callan one final time. The urbane mask had cracked, revealing something ugly beneath. "This is not over. You do not know who you are dealing with. Senator Wolf will—" "That is enough," Sullivan cut him off sharply. The agents pushed Cordell toward the waiting vehicle. Within 20 minutes, the clearing was empty except for the FBI team and Callan. Sullivan returned to where he sat, still wrapped in the thermal blanket, smoke pressed against his leg. "We will need you to come to Missoula for a full debriefing. Probably several days of statements and testimony, but after that, you are free to go." She paused, looking at the ruins of the cabin. "I am sorry about your home." Callan looked at the blackened timbers at the stone chimney standing alone like a monument. Strange that he did not feel the loss as sharply as he should. Everything he had owned was gone, but somehow he felt lighter rather than diminished. "It was not really mine. It was always Harding's. I was just borrowing it." Sullivan studied him for a moment, then reached into her coat and pulled out an envelope. This was in the evidence box, addressed to whoever found it. Callan took the envelope. The paper was yellowed with age, but the writing was clear. To the finder. Inside was a single sheet dated October 14th, 2009. "If you are reading this, I am gone. Thank you for finishing what I started. I have no family, no heirs. My will filed with the county clerk in 2008 leaves my property to whoever completes my investigation and brings the truth to light. The land is yours if you want it. Use it well. Protect what I could not. Elias Harding." Callan read it twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. 160 acres of Montana wilderness bought for $500 and paid for in blood and fire. Agent Sullivan was watching him. "What will you do with it?" Callan looked out across the valley at the mountains rising in the distance, at the forest stretching away in every direction. Somewhere out there, Copper Creek flowed carrying poison that would now be cleaned up. Somewhere in these hills, Elias Harding's body lay waiting to be found and properly buried. "I do not know yet." The debriefing in Missoula took 5 days. Callan told his story again and again to different agents, different prosecutors answering the same questions from slightly different angles. They were building a case he understood, one that would need to be ironclad to bring down a sitting senator. The evidence from Harding's cache was everything they had hoped for. The water samples, still viable after 15 years, proved contamination beyond any doubt. The notebooks provided timeline and intent. The digital files included internal Cordell communications that demonstrated knowledge of the illegal dumping. And the emails involving Senator Wolf, while carefully worded, showed a pattern of protection and cover-up that could not be explained away. On the third day, Sheriff Thorne broke, offered a plea deal that would ensure his son received continued medical care from a federal victims fund. He gave them everything. Names, dates, payments. He described how Cordell had recruited him in 2007, how the money had started small and grown larger as the crimes escalated. And he described the night of October 15th, 2009, when he had been called to handle the Harding problem. Callan was not present for Thorne's confession, but Sullivan shared the relevant details. 2 deputies, both now retired and living out of state, had forced Harding's truck off the road. They had beaten him when he fought back. And when it became clear that he would not survive the beating, they had made it look like an accident, dumping the truck into Copper Creek Ravine. But they had not found Harding's body to confirm death. He had crawled away into the forest badly injured. By the time search and rescue went looking, the trail was cold. "He might have survived," Sullivan said quietly. "For a few hours, maybe a day. But bleeding internally in October with no help coming." They found what was left of Elias Harding on the 7th day. A hiker had reported bones in a remote section of national forest land 15 miles from where the truck went over. The FBI forensics team confirmed the identity through dental records. Harding had made it farther than anyone expected before the cold and his injuries claimed him. Dutch Merrick identified the body formally, though there was little left to identify after 15 years. The old mechanic stood in the morgue with tears streaming down his weathered face, one hand on the steel table. "God damn it, Elias, you stubborn bastard. You never knew when to quit." But his voice held pride along with the grief. The media attention was intense. A murdered journalist, a corporate conspiracy, a senator implicated in cover-up. It had every element that the national news cycle craved. Callan found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never wanted. Reporters camped outside his hotel in Missoula, calling his phone at all hours. Ryan Baker arrived on the 4th day ostensibly to cover the story for the Denver Post, but really to check on his old friend. They met in a diner on the edge of town away from the media circus. Ryan looked older than Callan remembered, his hair thinner, his face more lined, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him a good medic and a better journalist. "You look like hell. You should see the other guy." They shared a brief smile, the kind of shorthand communication that came from shared history. Ryan ordered coffee and pie, Callan just coffee. Smoke lay under the table, his presence a comfort. "So, you stumbled into the story of the decade." "I stumbled into a $500 cabin. The story was already there waiting." Ryan pulled out a notebook, old habits dying hard. "Tell me about Harding, not for the paper, for me." So Callan did. He described the cabin, frozen in time, the notebooks documenting slow-building dread, the careful preparation of a man who knew he was running out of time. He described Smoke finding the cash, the weight of holding 15 years of silence in his hands. He was a good man doing good work. He deserved better than he got. Ryan nodded slowly, making notes. The charges against Cordell that are solid. Murder, conspiracy, environmental crimes, racketeering. He is looking at 30 years minimum. Thorne is cooperating, so maybe 12 to 15. But Wolf, he trailed off, shaking his head. The senator is already distancing himself. His lawyers are arguing he had no direct knowledge of the murder, that his involvement was purely business-related, that Cordell misled him. And he has resources, money, political connections. The Justice Department is not sure they can make the charges stick. So he might walk, probably will, at least on the murder charges. They can get him on corruption, maybe abuse of office. But the real architects of Harding's death were Cordell and Thorne. Callan stared into his coffee. Justice was supposed to be clean and complete. The guilty punished, the innocent vindicated. But reality was messier. Partial victories. Compromised outcomes. Harding would have understood. Journalists always do. Ryan studied him for a long moment. What are you going to do now? The property is yours legally. Harding's will was clear. I have been thinking about that. And Callan pulled out his phone and showed Ryan a photo he had taken earlier. It was a rough sketch drawn on hotel stationery. A cabin, small and efficient, built on the same foundation where Harding's had stood. Around it, other smaller structures. Barracks-style housing. A communal building. What is this? A retreat center. For veterans. A place to decompress, to work through things away from the noise. No therapy, no programs, just space and quiet and time. Harding wanted to protect Montana. Maybe this is how. Ryan looked at the sketch, then at Callan, then at Smoke sleeping peacefully under the table. That is a good thing you are planning. Expensive, though. The government is settling the civil suit against Cordell's company. Cleanup cost, damages, compensation to affected families. My lawyer thinks I could get $2.5 million as the finder of the evidence and the new owner of the contaminated property. Jesus, blood money. But maybe it can do some good. They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Before Ryan left, he clasped Callan's shoulder. Ellen would be proud of you. You know that, right? Callan felt something tighten his chest, loosen slightly. He had not spoken Ellen's name aloud in months, had been carrying her memory like a wound that would not heal. But hearing Ryan say it, hearing that she would be proud, helped. I hope so. The legal proceedings took another 6 weeks. Cordell was denied bail, deemed a flight risk. Senator Wolf resigned his seat amid mounting pressure, though the criminal charges against him remained uncertain. The state of Montana opened a formal investigation into the environmental damage, and cleanup operations began on the 12 contaminated sites Harding had identified. Dutch Merrick became the unofficial guardian of Harding's legacy, giving interviews, attending hearings, making sure that his friend's name was remembered correctly. When the county finally released Harding's remains for burial, it was Dutch who organized the funeral. It was held on a cold March morning, the ground still frozen, but the sun finally breaking through the clouds. A surprising number of people attended, journalists from across the country who had known Harding's work, environmental activists who had built on his findings, veterans who remembered serving with him, and Callan, who had never met the man but had inherited his fight. The service was simple. A minister spoke about courage and truth. Dutch gave a eulogy that was more anger than sadness, calling out by name those who had silenced his friend. And at the end, they lowered a simple pine casket into the Montana earth, finally bringing Elias Harding home. As people filed away, Dutch approached Callan. The old mechanic looked diminished somehow, as if laying his friend to rest had taken something essential from him. Thank you for finishing what he started. I did not do it alone. Callan gestured to Smoke, who sat quietly at his side. Dutch smiled, the first genuine smile Callan had seen from him. Elias always said the best people keep dogs, not the other way around. He would have liked you. Spring came slowly to Montana, but it came. The snow retreated from the valleys and green began to push through the dead grass. Callan returned to his property in late April when the roads were passable and the ground had thawed enough to begin construction. The insurance settlement had come through. The government compensation was still tied up in legal proceedings, but he had enough to start. He hired a local contractor, a man named Benson, who had known Harding and wanted to be part of rebuilding. They started with the foundation, using the old stone hearth as the centerpiece. The new cabin would be larger, more weatherproof, but it would honor the bones of what had stood before. Around it, they would build 3 smaller bunkhouses, each capable of housing 4 veterans, a communal kitchen and meeting hall, workshop space for those who found solace in working with their hands. Callan worked alongside the crew, his body remembering old skills, his mind focused on the physical tasks that left no room for ghosts. Smoke was a constant presence, supervising the work with the serious demeanor of a foreman, accepting treats from the workers during lunch breaks. On a warm day in June, when the main cabin's frame was up and the roof was being shingled, a car pulled into the clearing. A woman got out, maybe 50 years old, with dark hair touched with gray and eyes that were unmistakably familiar. She walked toward where Callan was working, her steps hesitant. When she was close enough to speak, she stopped. "Mr. Cross, my name is Rachel Harding. Elias was my brother." Callan set down his hammer and climbed down from the ladder. He had not known Harding had family. The man had seemed so alone in his notebooks, so isolated. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you." She looked around the property at the construction, at the mountains rising beyond. "I want you to know that I support what you are doing here." Elias would have approved. He always believed this land should be used to help people. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "This is his will, the official one filed with the county. My lawyer has reviewed it and it is legally binding. The property is yours free and clear." Elias was very specific that it should go to whoever brought his killers to justice. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will take care of it. Say you will remember him." "I will. I promise." Rachel nodded, tears bright in her eyes. She handed him the envelope, then pulled out something else. A photograph, old and creased. It showed a young Elias Harding in military fatigues, standing next to an M113 armored personnel carrier somewhere in Vietnam. He was smiling, young and vital and whole. "He was a good man, Mr. Cross. He deserved better than what they gave him. But because of you, at least he got justice. That is more than I hoped for." She left soon after, driving back down the long access road. Callan stood holding the photograph, studying the face of a man he had never met, but whose legacy he now carried. The retreat center opened quietly in September. No grand ceremony, no media coverage. Callan had contacted veterans organizations across Montana and the surrounding states, offering free housing for those who needed space and time. The only rules were simple: no violence, no hard drugs, pull your weight with chores. Everything else was negotiable. The first guest was a Marine named Torres, 28 years old, who had done 3 tours in Iraq and come home to find that civilian life made no sense. He stayed for 2 months, working on the fence line during the day and sitting by the fire with smoke in the evenings. When he left, he was not fixed, because healing did not work that way. But he was better, more settled, ready to try again. Others followed: Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, young and old men and women, all carrying wounds that did not show on x-rays. They came, they stayed as long as they needed, they left when they were ready. Some came back later, volunteers now wanting to help others the way they had been helped. Callan ran the place with a light hand, understanding that these people needed space more than structure. He cooked meals, maintained the buildings, organized work projects that gave purpose without pressure. And Smoke, gray and patient, moved among the guests like a therapist, without words, offering comfort through simple presence. On a cold evening in late October, almost exactly a year after he had first seen the cabin, Harrison sat on the porch of the new building. The mountains were dusted with the season's first snow, and smoke rose from the chimneys of all 4 structures. Inside, he could hear voices, laughter, the sounds of people learning to be human again. Smoke lay beside him, his head resting on Callan's leg. The dog was getting older, his muzzle almost completely white, now moving a little slower in the mornings. But his eyes were still bright, still alert, still watching over the people in his care. "We did good, boy." Callan scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the softness of fur and the solid warmth beneath. "I think Harding would say we did good." Smoke's tail thumped against the porch boards, a slow, contented rhythm. In Missoula, Silas Cordell sat in a federal prison cell awaiting trial. Sheriff Lucas Thorne had been sentenced to 12 years and was serving his time in a facility where the guards could ensure his son received regular updates. Senator Graham Wolfe had avoided criminal prosecution, but his political career was destroyed, his name synonymous with corruption. The cleanup of Cordell's contamination sites was ongoing, a process that would take years but had finally begun. And in a small cemetery outside town, Elias Harding rested under a simple stone that read, "He told the truth." That was enough. The stars came out, brilliant and countless in the clear mountain air. Callan thought about Ellen, about the promise he had made to keep living. He thought about the men and women inside fighting their own battles against invisible enemies. He thought about Harding, who had died for asking the right questions. And he thought about Smoke, who had found a secret beneath stone and ash, and in doing so had given Callan something he had not even known he was missing: a purpose larger than survival, a home built not from logs and nails, but from justice and remembrance. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the smell of coming winter. Inside, someone started playing a guitar, the notes drifting out into the night. Smoke sighed and shifted closer, warm and alive and loyal. Callan closed his eyes and let the moment wash over him. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of something worth fighting for, worth living for. Home. The single beam of Garrett's flashlight turned the small security office into a cell of harsh light and deep shadow. The cold was absolute, a presence that deadened sound and slowed thought. Garrett sat on the concrete floor, Theodore Lawson's confession resting on his knee, the pages trembling slightly in his hands. Ranger, sensing the profound shift in his human's demeanor, the replacement of despair with a new vibrating tension, pressed his heavy body firmly against Garrett's back. It was a silent, warm anchor in the frozen darkness. Garrett read the letter again, and then a third time. He was no longer reading it as a stranger stumbling onto someone else's tragedy. He was reading it as a witness, as someone who understood exactly what Theodore had felt, exactly what fear could do to a man's spine, exactly how easy it was to let the powerful win. The first page had been Theodore's confession, his coward's plea for forgiveness. But the pages beneath it, which Garrett had barely registered in his initial shock, contained the context, the full story. Theodore, in his frantic, terrified script, had laid out everything. Jonathan Lawson wasn't just his brother. He was his opposite in every way that mattered. Where Theodore was cautious, Jonathan was brave. Where Theodore saw risk, Jonathan saw opportunity. Not opportunity for money or power, but for change, for making things better. In the mid-1990s, Pittsburgh was dying. The steel industry that had built the city into an economic powerhouse had collapsed. Mills that had employed tens of thousands sat empty and rusting. Neighborhoods that had thrived for generations were hollowing out as people fled to find work elsewhere. The air was cleaner than it had been in decades, but only because the furnaces had gone cold. Jonathan Lawson was an environmental activist, but not the kind that Garrett had encountered in his later years, the professional protesters with their coordinated social media campaigns. Jonathan was a local idealist, a man who believed that Pittsburgh's industrial scars could be healed, that the poisoned land could be cleaned and reused, that the city could have a future beyond rust and abandonment. In 1995, Jonathan had pooled everything. He had every dollar of savings, every line of credit he could secure, and bought a massive piece of property, the Meridian Steelworks, the very place where Garrett and Ranger now sat in the darkness. Jonathan bought it because it was toxic, because it was a blight, because nobody else wanted it. His plan, outlined in Theodore's shaky handwriting, was ambitious and maybe naive. He wanted to remediate the land, to clean the poison from the soil, to remove the contaminated groundwater, and then build something for the community. Affordable housing, green space, a place where working families could live without being priced out by developers. But Jonathan wasn't the only one who wanted the Meridian land. The letter named him clearly, Calvin Bishop. Even Garrett, disconnected as he'd been from the city's affairs for the past 2 years, living under bridges and in abandoned buildings, had seen that name. It was etched onto the sides of sleek new buildings downtown, on plaques at university centers, on glossy billboards promising luxury condos with river views. Calvin Bishop was a developer, but according to Theodore's letter, he was more than that. He was a man who didn't just build on the skyline. He owned it. He shaped it. He decided what Pittsburgh would become. And Bishop had wanted the Meridian land, but he didn't want to clean it. He didn't want to remediate decades of industrial contamination. That was expensive, time-consuming, and cut into profit margins. Bishop's plan, according to documents that Jonathan had obtained and Theodore described, was simpler. Bury the problem, build on top of poisoned ground. Create a massive shipping and logistics depot capitalizing on the property's river access and proximity to major highways. And to do that, he needed the city to rezone the land from toxic industrial to commercial use. Jonathan Lawson found the proof of falsified environmental reports. Reports that claimed soil contamination levels were within acceptable limits when they were actually 20 times higher. Proof of bribes paid to city zoning officials, documented payments funneled through shell companies. Proof that Bishop was planning to build on ground so contaminated that it would risk the health of every person who worked there and every family in the surrounding neighborhoods. Jonathan, the idealist, the man who believed in the system, was going to expose it all. He was taking his evidence to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. He had already scheduled a meeting with an investigative reporter. Theodore's letter described the night before Jonathan died. How his brother had come to his apartment excited and terrified in equal measure. How Jonathan had shown him everything. The ledgers, the photographs of Bishop meeting with city officials, the environmental reports with the data altered, the recording Jonathan had made of his own confrontation with Bishop, where he'd given the developer one chance to come clean voluntarily. Theodore had begged him not to do it, had pleaded with Jonathan to think of his daughter Audrey, just 6 years old, had warned him that men like Calvin Bishop didn't lose. They destroyed anyone who threatened them. But Jonathan had been adamant. This was bigger than one man's safety. This was about hundreds of families who would be poisoned, about a city being sold out by corruption. The next day, there was a gas leak at Jonathan's small office in Lawrenceville, an explosion. The fire department responded within minutes, but it was too late. Jonathan Lawson died in the blast along with every piece of physical evidence he'd been keeping in that office. The investigation lasted less than a week. The fire marshal ruled it an accidental death caused by faulty gas line maintenance. The newspaper obituaries called Jonathan a dedicated environmentalist who had tragically died in a preventable accident, the kind of thing that happens when passionate people cut corners on safety. Case closed. Story over. Except Theodore knew the truth because Jonathan had told him everything the night before. And 2 days after the funeral, Calvin Bishop's people came to Theodore. They were polite, professional. They wore expensive suits and had law degrees from prestigious universities. They didn't threaten Theodore with violence. They were far too sophisticated for that. They talked about Jonathan's daughter Audrey, about her school, about her routine, about the park where she played. They never said anything explicit, never made a direct threat that could be recorded or testified to in court. They just made sure Theodore understood that little girls were vulnerable, that accidents happened, that the world was a dangerous place for children without family to protect them. And then they made him an offer. Jonathan's will left everything to Theodore. The Meridian Steelworks, the dream, the burden. Bishop's lawyers presented documents. They offered to buy the property. The price was far below market value, barely enough to cover Jonathan's outstanding debts. But they made it clear that this was the only offer. There would be no negotiation, no second chance. Theodore, terrified for his niece, for himself, signed the papers. But he did one thing, one small act of defiance wrapped in cowardice. He kept the original deed. The master title notarized and officially filed when Jonathan first purchased the property. He told Bishop's lawyers it had been lost in the fire. He gave them copies, signed transfer documents, everything they asked for. But not the original. Theodore didn't know if it mattered legally. The letter was uncertain on that point, written by a man who understood fear better than law. But he'd kept it anyway, hidden in the metal box, along with everything else Jonathan had gathered. And then Theodore had run, left Pittsburgh, changed his phone number, spent 29 years looking over his shoulder, waiting for Calvin Bishop's people to realize he still had the evidence, still had the power to destroy everything they'd built. But they never came. Either they didn't know or they didn't care, or they were confident that Theodore Lawson was too broken to ever be a threat. They were right. Theodore never told anyone. Never went to the authorities, never sought justice for his brother. Until January 2025, when Theodore, dying and desperate to unburden his soul, used his last money to pay for a storage unit, used his last strength to hide the evidence, and wrote a letter to whoever might find it begging them to do what he'd been too afraid to do, to tell the truth. Garrett carefully folded the pages and placed them back in the manila folder. He sat in the dark, the flashlight beam growing weaker as the batteries drained, and thought about Dylan Foster. He thought about Captain Alexander Crane's cold eyes and colder voice, about signing that false report, about watching Dylan's widow at the funeral, holding their infant daughter, believing the lie that her husband had been careless, had failed to follow safety protocols. Garrett had told himself for 11 years that there was nothing he could have done, that fighting the system was pointless, that Captain Crane had all the power and Garrett had none, that speaking up would have cost him everything and changed nothing. But sitting here in the frozen ruins of Jonathan Lawson's dream, holding evidence of another cover-up, another good man destroyed by powerful men who valued profit over lives, Garrett understood something with brutal clarity. He had been Theodore Lawson, afraid, complicit, choosing survival over honor, and it had destroyed him just as surely as speaking up might have. The question now was whether Garrett Hayes could become Jonathan Lawson, whether he could find the courage that the idealistic environmentalist had found 30 years ago, whether he could fight back even knowing how it might end. He looked down at Ranger, who was watching him with those intelligent amber eyes that seemed to see everything. "What do you think, boy?" Garrett whispered. Think we can do this? Ranger's tail thumped once against the concrete floor. Not the excited wagging of a pet, but the single deliberate thump of a military working dog acknowledging a mission briefing. Okay then. Garrett opened the small wooden box next. Inside, resting on faded red velvet that might have been beautiful once, were the fragments of Jonathan Lawson's life. A child's drawing in crayon, two stick figures holding hands labeled in a 6-year-old's handwriting, Daddy and Me. A small silver locket on a delicate chain. And a stack of photographs, their colors faded but still clear. A young man with kind eyes and unruly dark hair, maybe 30 years old, standing in front of the Meridian Steelworks with a shovel over his shoulder. Jonathan Lawson on the day he'd bought the property, ready to build his dream. Another photo of Jonathan kneeling beside a small garden plot, dirt on his hands, smiling at the camera. And then the photograph that made Garrett's throat tighten. Jonathan holding a little girl with bright eyes and dark pigtails, maybe 6 years old, lifting her onto his shoulders. Both of them laughing, caught in a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. Audrey Lawson, 30 years ago. She would be a woman now, 35, 36 years old. A woman who had grown up believing her father died in a careless accident. A woman who'd had her entire legacy, the proof of her father's courage and sacrifice, stolen from her by fear and corruption. Garrett studied the photograph for a long time. He saw Jonathan's smile, saw the love in the way he held his daughter, saw the hope and idealism that had gotten him killed. He carefully placed everything back in the wooden box and closed the lid. Then he looked at the black metal case with its 3 combination locks. The objective, the evidence, the truth that Theodore had been too afraid to use and that Garrett now had to deliver. But first he had to find her. He had to find Audrey Lawson. The problem was simple. Garrett had no phone, no computer, no internet access, no way to search for someone in a city of 300,000 people. He had 53 cents in his pocket and a dog who needed to eat. But he had something else, something the Army had trained into him until it became instinct. The ability to adapt, to improvise, to complete the mission with whatever resources were available. There was one place in Pittsburgh that offered information and technology to anyone who walked through the door, no questions asked. A place Garrett had used before, back when he'd first become homeless and needed to file paperwork with the VA, the Carnegie Library in Oakland. The next morning, Garrett woke before dawn. He'd slept fitfully, his mind racing through scenarios and plans. Ranger was already awake, sitting at attention near the door, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. Garrett went through his supplies with the methodical efficiency of a soldier preparing for a mission. He had no food left for himself or for Ranger. That would have to wait. The mission came first. Always. He placed the small wooden box and Theodore's letter in the bottom of his backpack, wrapped carefully in his spare shirt. The metal case he rewrapped in his sleeping bag and hid under a loose floor panel he'd discovered near the wall. It was too heavy and too conspicuous to carry through the city in daylight. The walk to Oakland took 45 minutes. Garrett's knee ached with every step, but he pushed through the pain. Ranger walked at his left heel, silent and focused, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds. The Carnegie Library loomed before them like a palace from another age, all sandstone and architectural grandeur, a monument to an era when Pittsburgh believed in the transformative power of knowledge and public institutions. The bronze doors were flanked by marble columns. The steps leading up to the entrance were clean, recently salted against ice. And mounted on a brass plaque near those doors was a sign that stopped Garrett cold. No animals permitted. Service animals only. Garrett's throat tightened. He had not been separated from Ranger for more than a few minutes in the past 2 years. The dog was his anchor, his early warning system, the living proof that he was still connected to something real and good in the world. But Ranger wasn't a registered service animal. He was a retired military working dog, but the paperwork Garrett had received when he adopted Ranger didn't include official service animal certification. That required training fees, documentation that Garrett couldn't afford and didn't have. He led Ranger to a thick stone column near the entrance, partially sheltered from the wind. He knelt down, his bad knee protesting, and looked the dog directly in the eyes. "I have to go in, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite control. "I need you to wait here. You have to wait for me. I will come back. I promise. Do you understand? I promise." Ranger let out a low, anxious whine. It was a sound Garrett had rarely heard from the professional, disciplined animal. The dog pressed his head hard against Garrett's chest, and Garrett felt the trembling in the powerful body. Ranger was afraid, not of the cold or the strangers passing by, but of being left. Garrett's hands shook as he looped Ranger's leash around the stone column. He tied it with a knot that was secure, but not too tight, making sure the dog had enough slack to lie down to move to be comfortable. Guard Garrett commanded, his voice barely audible. "Wait, good boy, I'll be back." He stood and walked backward toward the doors, his heart pounding a sick rhythm. Ranger sat rigid at the column, his amber eyes locked on Garrett, every muscle in his body tense with the effort of not following, not breaking the command. The moment the heavy bronze doors closed between them, cutting off line of sight, Garrett felt a physical pain in his chest, like something vital had been severed. The transition from the bitter cold outside to the heated interior of the library was jarring. Garrett stepped into a world of profound warmth, hushed silence, and the soft, dry scent of old paper and furniture polish. Students sat at long oak tables, their faces illuminated by the glow of laptop screens. Elderly people read newspapers in comfortable chairs. Everything was clean, orderly, peaceful. Garrett felt intensely visible. His worn leather jacket, his rough beard, the dirt under his fingernails, the smell of the street that clung to his clothes despite his best efforts. He was a stain on this pristine quiet, a reminder of failure that made people uncomfortable. He kept his head down, ignoring the polite but curious glance from the librarian at the front desk, and found the public computer terminals in a quiet alcove on the second floor. He sat down in a chair that was surprisingly comfortable, took a steadying breath, and began the hunt. The library's computers had free internet access for up to 2 hours per day. Garrett's fingers, stiff from cold and disuse, moved slowly across the keyboard. He hadn't used a computer regularly in over a year, and the muscle memory was rusty. First, he searched for the victim. Jonathan Lawson, 1996 Pittsburgh. The library's high-speed connection was shockingly fast compared to what Garrett remembered. Results flooded the screen in milliseconds. He found the old newspaper archives from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, digitized and searchable. The articles loaded on the screen, and Garrett read them with growing anger. "Tragic gas leak claims local activist" was the headline from February 1996. The article was brief, clinical, and final. It described Jonathan Lawson as a well-meaning environmental advocate who had died in an accidental explosion at his office. The fire marshal was quoted as saying the gas line had been improperly maintained. There were expressions of sympathy from local officials, a statement from the mayor about the importance of workplace safety. "Community mourns." Jonathan Lawson read another headline, this one with a photograph of Jonathan that Garrett recognized from the wooden box. The article painted Jonathan as idealistic, but perhaps naive, a man whose passion sometimes led him to cut corners. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But it was printed in the newspaper of record, archived, and accepted as historical fact. The investigation, such as it was, had been closed within days. No follow-up articles, no questions asked, just another tragic accident in a city that had seen thousands of industrial deaths over the decades. Next, Garrett searched for the killer. Calvin Bishop, Pittsburgh. The screen flooded with results. It was a digital monument to power and influence. Bishop Corporation pledges $5 million to Children's Hospital. The article showed a photograph of an elderly man with white hair and an expensive suit shaking hands with a hospital administrator, both of them smiling for the camera. Calvin Bishop honored as Philanthropist of the Year. Another photo, this time at a gala dinner, Bishop in a tuxedo surrounded by city officials and business leaders. New Bishop Tower to reshape Pittsburgh's skyline. An architectural rendering of a gleaming glass building, 40 stories of steel and ambition. Garrett felt a familiar cold sickness rising in his stomach. This was Captain Alexander Crane on a grand scale. Bishop wasn't just protected by the system. He was the system, an institution, shielded by a firewall of charitable donations and civic goodwill and connections that ran so deep they were invisible. The man who had murdered Jonathan Lawson was now celebrated as the city's savior, the visionary who was dragging Pittsburgh into the 21st century. The anger and futility of it made Garrett's hands tremble on the keyboard. He thought of Dylan Foster. He thought of the lie that had buried his friend, the false report that protected Greylock Industrial Solutions and Captain Crane's career. This was the same lie, just written larger, written in marble and steel and newspaper ink. But Garrett wasn't here for the killer. Not yet. He was here for the heir. He typed carefully, Audrey Lawson, Pittsburgh. He scrolled through several results. Most were obituaries or public records for different people with the same name scattered across the country. Nothing local, nothing recent. Then he saw it. An article dated 3 weeks prior from a small community blog called Pittsburgh Neighborhoods Watch. The headline read, Activist Audrey Lawson challenges Bishop Corporation's new riverfront project. Garrett clicked the link, his heart hammering. The article loaded with a photograph. A woman in her mid-30s stood at a podium in what looked like a community center meeting room. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, strong features, and eyes that were instantly unmistakably familiar. The same eyes as the little girl in the photograph, the same eyes as Jonathan Lawson. She was pointing at a large map on the wall behind her, her expression intense and focused. Garrett read the article with growing amazement. Audrey Lawson, director of the Pittsburgh Community Justice Alliance, had formally filed a complaint with the city zoning board regarding Bishop Corporation's latest development project. She was claiming that the corporation's environmental impact studies were flawed, that they were ignoring serious contamination issues, and that the project posed health risks to the surrounding neighborhoods. She was challenging Calvin Bishop, publicly, loudly. Jonathan Lawson's daughter had grown up to continue her father's fight, never knowing it was a fight, never knowing she was facing the same enemy who had killed her father 30 years ago. She was armed only with passion and public records and belief in the system, while Calvin Bishop held the bloody truth of what had happened to her father, held it as insurance as leverage, as a weapon to use if she ever became too much of a problem. Garrett stared at the photograph of Audrey Lawson and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about honoring Jonathan's memory anymore. This wasn't just about Theodore's guilty conscience or Garrett's own need for redemption. Audrey was in danger. She didn't know it, but she was walking the same path her father had walked, heading toward the same cliff edge. And Calvin Bishop, now in his 70s and probably more ruthless than ever, would not hesitate to do to the daughter what he'd done to the father. Garrett had to reach her, had to warn her, had to give her the evidence that would either save her life or end it, depending on what she chose to do with it. He found the website for the Pittsburgh Community Justice Alliance. It was simple, functional, clearly built by volunteers rather than professional designers. There was a contact page with an email form, but Garrett couldn't use it. An email was traceable, digital. It would create a record that Bishop's people could find, could intercept, could use to track both of them. After 30 years of silence, the last thing Garrett wanted to do was send up a digital flare announcing that someone had found Theodore's evidence. He needed to do this the old way, the soldier's way, analog, untraceable. He noted the organization's office address, a small suite in a building downtown on 4th Avenue. He memorized it, repeated it 3 times in his head until it was locked in. Then he logged off the computer and walked to the library's small gift shop on the first floor. He used his last 53 cents, plus the handful of pennies he found in his jacket pocket, to buy a single plain greeting card and 1 stamped envelope. The cashier, a young woman with kind eyes, counted his change and handed him the items without comment or judgment. Garrett found an empty table in the main reading room, a vast space with soaring ceilings and walls lined with books that reached toward the sky. He sat down, took out a pen he'd found on the street weeks ago and opened the greeting card. His handwriting was rough, slanted, and irregular from years in the service and lack of practice, but it was legible. He kept the message brief, sterile, urgent. Miss Lawson, you do not know me. I have found something that belonged to your father, Jonathan Lawson, from 1996. It is a private matter of the highest importance. I believe it contains information he was trying to protect before he died. Information about his death. I cannot send this electronically. I cannot bring it to your office. It is not safe for either of us if I do. If you wish to see this, you must meet me in person. I am taking a great risk by contacting you. So I need you to understand this is real. He paused, thinking. He needed proof. Something that would make Audrey Lawson take this seriously. Something that would prove this wasn't a hoax or a scam. Garrett opened his backpack and carefully removed the small wooden box. He opened it and took out one photograph, the clearest one. Jonathan Lawson holding 6-year-old Audrey on his shoulders, both of them laughing in frozen joy. He also took a single page from Theodore's letter. Not the part about the murder, not the confession. Just a paragraph near the beginning, where Theodore described Jonathan's dream for the Meridian Steelworks, his vision of cleaning the land and building affordable housing. Garrett went to the library's copy machine and made a single grainy photocopy of that page. The quality was poor, deliberately so, just enough to prove authenticity without giving away too much. He folded the photocopy and the original photograph into the card. Then he continued writing. I will be at Shenley Park by the main fountain near the cafe. This Saturday, February 14th at 2:00 p.m. I will be wearing a brown leather jacket and I will have a German Shepherd with me. His name is Ranger. Please come alone. If I see anyone else with you, I will leave and you will never hear from me again. This is about your father's life and death. This is about truth. He signed it simply, a friend who knew your Uncle Theodore. Garrett sealed the envelope and addressed it carefully to Audrey Lawson, care of the Pittsburgh Community Justice Alliance with the 4th Avenue address. He walked to the library's main doors, and stepped back out into the brutal cold. Ranger saw him the instant the doors opened. The dog had been sitting in exactly the same position, rigid and trembling, his eyes locked on those bronze doors. The moment he saw Garrett, his entire body seemed to release its tension. His tail began to wag, not the slow thump of acknowledgement, but the full body wag of relief and joy. Garrett knelt and buried his face in the dog's cold fur. "I'm sorry, boy," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm here. I kept my promise." Ranger whined and licked Garrett's face, pushed his head against Garrett's chest, every movement communicating forgiveness and trust, and the simple statement, "You came back." Garrett untied the leash, and they walked together down the library steps, two figures against the gray winter sky. 3 blocks away, on the corner of Forbes Avenue, stood a blue United States Postal Service mailbox. Garrett walked up to it, the envelope in his hand feeling suddenly heavy with consequence. This was it, the point of no return. Once he dropped this letter into the box, he was committed. He would be involving Audrey Lawson in something that could save her or destroy her. He would be painting a target on both of their backs. But he thought of Dylan Foster. He thought of Jonathan Lawson. He thought of all the good men who had been ground up by systems that valued power over justice. He thought of Theodore Lawson, living in fear for 29 years, dying with the weight of cowardice crushing his soul. Garrett held the envelope for one more moment, then he opened the mail slot and let it drop. The sound of the letter falling into the dark metal box was soft, almost inaudible, against the noise of traffic. But to Garrett, it felt as final as a declaration of war. The first move had been made. The 3 days between mailing the letter and the appointed Saturday meeting were a special kind of hell for Garrett Hayes. He and Ranger hunkered down in the cold security office at the Meridian Steelworks, existing in a state of suspended animation, waiting for a meeting that might never happen. Garrett had no way to know if Audrey Lawson had received the letter. No way to know if she'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a crazy person. No way to know if she'd take the risk of meeting a stranger in a public park based on a cryptic note and a 30-year-old photograph. All he could do was wait and prepare. He ventured out only once during those 3 days under cover of darkness on Thursday night to retrieve the heavy metal case from its hiding place beneath the loose floor panel. He brought it back to the office where it sat in the corner like a dark promise. His mind replayed the scenario over and over, running through tactical considerations the way he'd been trained in the Army, meeting an unknown contact in an exposed position while carrying high-value intelligence. The scenario was agonizingly familiar, the same kind of mission brief he'd received dozens of times in Afghanistan. But this time there was no squad backing him up, no air support, no extraction plan, just him and Ranger against whatever came. The old instincts, the hypervigilance that was both PTSD and survival training returned with a vengeance. Garrett slept no more than a few hours each night. He sat with his back to the wall, listening to the wind howl through the skeletal remains of the steel mill, one hand resting on Ranger's warm flank. The dog was his only connection to reality, to the present moment. Without that steady breathing beside him, Garrett knew he would have slipped completely into the fog of paranoia and memory. Saturday arrived gray and unforgiving, the sky a low ceiling of bruised purple clouds that promised more snow. The temperature had dropped to 8 degrees, the kind of cold that made every breath painful. At noon, Garrett ate the last of his rations, a half sandwich he'd found behind a bakery on Thursday. He fed Ranger the remaining handful of kibble, watching the dog eat with mechanical efficiency. "No matter what happens today, boy," Garrett said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears, "tonight, one way or another, I'll get you a real meal, I promise." Ranger looked up at him with those amber eyes that reflected unwavering trust. They left the steelworks an hour early at 1 p.m., taking a broken, circuitous route to Shenley Park. Garrett needed time to observe the objective, to scan for threats, to identify escape routes. The metal case wrapped in what remained of his sleeping bag was heavy under his arm. The wooden box and Theodore's letter were secure in his backpack. Everything he owned, everything that mattered, was on his person. Shenley Park was windswept and nearly empty. The large fountain he'd designated as the meeting point was dry, its stone basins layered with brown frozen leaves and a dusting of old snow. Garrett didn't approach the fountain. Not yet. He found a position on a slight rise about 50 yards away, partially obscured by bare-branched oak trees. It gave him clear sight of the fountain, the nearby closed cafe, and the small parking area. He set down his burden and waited, Ranger sitting alert at his side. At 1:58 p.m., Garrett's heart began to pound with heavy military cadence. Ranger sensed the spike in adrenaline and stood, his body suddenly rigid. It's all right, Garrett murmured, though it was a lie. His hand found the ruff of fur at Ranger's neck. At 1:59 p.m., a practical blue Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot. The door opened and a woman got out. Garrett's breath caught. It was her, Audrey Lawson. He recognized her instantly from the photograph on the community blog, though seeing her in person carried a weight that pixels on a screen couldn't convey. She was tall, maybe 5'8", and moved with quick, impatient energy. She wore a sensible dark wool peacoat over jeans and sturdy boots. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry except for a simple silver watch. She looked exactly like what she was, an overworked community organizer with too much to do and not enough resources. But as she drew closer to the fountain, Garrett saw something else. Her father's eyes. The same intelligent, determined eyes from the photograph, though hers held a weariness that Jonathan's had not. She stood by the fountain, arms crossed against the cold, scanning the nearly empty park. She was visibly tense, shoulders tight, jaw set. She looked like someone expecting a trap. Garrett took a deep breath. Okay, boy, let's go. He stepped out from the trees, the metal case under his arm, Ranger moving at his left heel in perfect formation. They crossed the open ground, exposed and vulnerable. Audrey saw them immediately. Her hand flew to her coat pocket, perhaps gripping her phone or pepper spray. She took a half step back, ready to run. Garrett stopped about 10 feet away. He held up one hand, palm out, in the universal gesture of peace. Miss Lawson, his voice was rough. Thank you for coming. You're the one who sent the letter, Audrey stated. It wasn't a question. Her eyes darted from Garrett's weathered face to the powerful dog at his side, then back. She was calculating, assessing threat levels, looking for exits. I am Garrett, confirmed. My name is Garrett Hayes, and this is Ranger. Audrey's eyes narrowed. You said you had something of my father's. Her voice was sharp-clipped. This isn't a good time for games, Mr. Hayes. What is this really about? Garrett could see her bracing for a con, for some elaborate sob story from a homeless veteran looking to exploit her sympathy. He knew exactly how he looked to her. Desperate, dangerous, possibly delusional. He had one chance to break through her defenses. Slowly, carefully, he unzipped his backpack with his free hand. He reached inside and pulled out the small wooden mahogany box. He didn't hand it to her. Not yet. He just held it where she could see it. This belonged to him, Garrett said quietly. To your father. Audrey's eyes fixed on the box. Her expression wavered just for a moment. And this, Garrett continued, pulling out the original photograph, was inside. He held it out, extending his arm fully so she could take it without coming too close. Audrey hesitated, then stepped forward and took the small, faded square of paper. Garrett watched her face as she looked at the image. Watched as every defensive wall she'd constructed simply dissolved. Her breath caught in a small, sharp gasp. Her fingers traced the image of her younger self being held by her father, both frozen in a moment of joy. My God, she whispered, her voice breaking. I don't have this one. I thought they were all lost. In the fire. Her gaze snapped up to Garrett's face, suspicion replaced by raw confusion. Where did you get this? It was hidden, Garrett said carefully. Hidden with other things, important things, things your father wanted to protect. He pulled out the folded photocopy of Theodore's letter. He handed it to her. Audrey unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Her eyes scanned the shaky handwriting, her brow furrowing as she read about her father's dream for the Meridian Steelworks. Her face went pale. All color drained from her cheeks, and she swayed, putting a hand on the cold stone of the fountain to steady herself. She was connecting the words to the fight she was currently waging. Seeing the pattern, seeing that she was walking her father's path without knowing it. Who are you? She asked again, but this time it was a plea. I found it, Garrett said. In a storage unit. Your Uncle Theodore hid it there before he died. He left a letter explaining everything. Audrey's eyes widened. My Uncle Theo. The name seemed to wound her. He told us everything was gone. He told us to leave Pittsburgh. He said it wasn't safe. And then he just disappeared. He was afraid, Garrett said quietly. Audrey looked away, staring at the frozen leaves in the fountain. When she spoke again, her voice was different. The emotion was gone, replaced by cold, hard clarity. I knew it, she said flatly. I always knew my father's death wasn't an accident. She looked back at Garrett. My mother knew it too. Until the day she died, she knew something was wrong. The official story never made sense. My father was meticulous about safety. He would never have been careless. She took a shuddering breath. Mr. Hayes, you have stepped into something you do not understand. I've been fighting Bishop Corporation for 6 months. I run a community organization. We try to hold developers accountable, and Bishop doesn't fight fair. Garrett remained silent, letting her talk. I thought I was being paranoid, Audrey said. Strange clicks on my phone. My office has been broken into twice, but nothing was ever taken. Two of my biggest donors pulled their funding last month. I've had my car followed. Her voice rose slightly, fear breaking through. They're watching me. I've known it. And now you show up with evidence, and they saw us meet. Garrett's combat instincts kicked into high alert. What do you mean? Audrey laughed without humor. Mr. Hayes, I'm the primary opposition to Calvin Bishop's new riverfront development. I've filed formal complaints with the city. I've made myself a very visible problem for a very powerful man. You think they're not monitoring me? She looked around the empty park. They saw me drive here. They saw a homeless man pass me something. They don't know what we discussed, but they know we met, which means you're in danger now, too. She looked down at Ranger. We need to move, Garrett said. This location is compromised. Audrey nodded. But where I can't go home. If they're watching me going home puts my daughter at risk. I have the rest of it, Garrett said urgently. The proof your uncle mentioned, it's in a metal box. 3 combination locks. I have it hidden. It's safe. Audrey's eyes widened. Real proof of what happened. Your uncle's letter said so. Documents, ledgers, reports, and the original deed to the Meridian Steelworks, the land your father bought. The deed, Audrey breathed. Her mind was racing. That's why he could never fully develop that property. If my father was the legal owner and the deed was never properly transferred, then Bishop's claim is questionable. She took a breath. We can't go to the police, she said firmly. Bishop has connections throughout the city. The letter mentioned bribes to officials. If we go to the police with this, the evidence disappears and we disappear with it. So what do we do? Garrett asked. There's one person, Audrey said slowly. One man who tried to take down Bishop before. His name is Declan Hayes, former FBI. Garrett felt a jolt at the surname. Any relation, Audrey asked. Not that I know of, Garrett said. He was building a corruption case in the late 90s, Audrey explained. Started investigating zoning irregularities, found a trail to city officials, and eventually to Calvin Bishop. He spent 2 years building his case, and his investigation was stonewalled from the inside, Audrey said bitterly. His supervisors transferred his team. His evidence was classified under national security protocols. After September 11th, they used terrorism concerns as an excuse to bury it. Declan knew it was Bishop pulling strings. He resigned in protest. He's been working as a private security consultant ever since. Can he open the locks? If anyone can, it's Declan Hayes, Audrey said. He was one of the Bureau's best. Then we need to see him, Garrett said. Now. Audrey pulled out her phone, hesitated. They might be monitoring my calls. Payphone, Garrett suggested. There's one outside the cafe, Garrett said, nodding toward the building. Audrey used the payphone, speaking in low, urgent tones. Garrett couldn't hear the conversation, but he saw her body language shift. The way her shoulders relaxed slightly, she hung up and turned to Garrett. He'll meet us, but not at his office. Too exposed. He's got a warehouse in the industrial district. He's heading there now. She looked at Garrett's worn clothing, at the bundle under his arm, at Ranger. My car, she said. Both of you get in. Garrett hesitated. If anyone's following you, we're leading them right to the evidence. If anyone's following me, they already know something's happening, Audrey countered. And I'm not letting you out of my sight. That box doesn't leave my presence until we're with Declan. Garrett recognized the steel in her voice. She was Jonathan Lawson's daughter. Fair enough, he said. They walked to her Honda. Audrey unlocked it, and Garrett opened the back door. Ranger up, he commanded. The dog leaped into the back seat. Garrett climbed in after him, settling the metal case on his lap. It was the first time he'd been inside a vehicle in over a year. The warmth from the heater was almost overwhelming. Audrey got in the driver's seat, started the engine, and sat for a moment gripping the wheel. Her hands were shaking. He murdered my father, she whispered. Calvin Bishop murdered my father 30 years ago, and he's been celebrated as a hero ever since. Her voice hardened. Let's go see what Uncle Theo left us. She put the car in gear and pulled out. Declan Hayes' warehouse was tucked into an industrial district that looked like it had been slowly dying since the steel mills closed. The building was nondescript gray concrete with a simple sign, Hayes Security Consulting. Audrey parked in the alley behind the building. She led them to a side door and knocked 3 times, then twice, then once. The door opened immediately. The man standing there was in his early 60s with a neatly trimmed gray beard and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He wore a button-down shirt, and Garrett spotted the bulge of a shoulder holster. This was Declan Hayes, a man who had left the FBI, but whose training had never left him. Audrey, he said, his voice a calm baritone. He nodded to Garrett, assessing him. Then his gaze dropped to Ranger. Military working dog retired, Garrett confirmed. Explosive detection, Army. Declan nodded with respect. Come in. They stepped into the warehouse. The interior was sparse but professional. A desk, computers, filing cabinets, a workbench covered with tools. Everything clean and organized. Declan closed and locked the door, then faced them. All right, he said. Audrey gave me the basics. You found Theodore Lawson's evidence. Jonathan's murder in '96. Bishop, I need to see it. Garrett set the metal case on the desk with a heavy thud. He pulled out Theodore's letter and the wooden box from his backpack. This is everything Garrett said. The letter explains it. But I couldn't open the case. Declan picked up the letter, first reading with an expression that barely changed. But Garrett saw the slight tightening around his eyes. When Declan finished, he set the letter down and looked at Audrey. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry this happened to your father. Audrey nodded, unable to speak. Declan turned to the metal case. He ran his fingers over the locks. Late '80s, early '90s military issue, he said. High-security tumbler locks. Whoever packed this knew what they were doing. Can you open it? Garrett asked. Declan permitted himself a thin smile. The Bureau teaches you how to break things, Mr. Hayes, but it also teaches you how to unbreak them. He went to his workbench and returned with delicate tools and a stethoscope. He put the earpieces in and pressed the bell against the first lock. Ranger lay down by the door in guard position. The room fell silent except for soft metallic whispers and quiet clicking. Declan worked with surgical patience. 20 minutes passed, one Declan murmured. The first lock clicked open. He moved to the second, more turning, more listening. 2. The third lock took nearly 15 minutes. Finally, his eyes brightened. 3. He released the latches. The internal locking bar released with a heavy thud. Declan looked at Audrey. It's your history. You should open it. Audrey stepped forward, hands shaking. She placed her palms on the lid and paused, preparing herself. Then she lifted it. The contents were perfectly preserved. The air that escaped smelled of old paper and leather and typewriter ink. Declan began lifting items out, handling them like artifacts. Item 1, he said, a leather-bound journal. Audrey opened it. Her father's neat handwriting filled every page. She let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. It's his handwriting. Item 2, Declan continued. Meridian zoning permits 1995. He fanned them out. Each bore the official Pittsburgh City seal. These are the falsified documents, Declan said. The ones claiming contamination levels were acceptable. Item 3, 2 hardbound ledgers. Bishop Corporation financial records. He opened one and ran his finger down entries. Shell companies, consulting fees. This is bribe money meticulously documented. How much? Audrey asked. Declan did quick math. 47 payments over 18 months. North of 800,000 in '96 money. 1.5 million adjusted for inflation. And this, Garrett said, pointing to the bottom. Declan reached in and pulled out a small black object. A microcassette tape recorder. My God, Audrey breathed. He recorded them. We need to hear this, Declan said. He went to his workshop and returned with an old cassette player. I keep equipment for legacy media. He inserted the cassette and pressed play. The room filled with tape hiss. Then voices emerged. The first voice was younger Ernest. Mr. Bishop, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me. That's him, Audrey whispered, tears streaming. That's my father. I've never heard his voice. The second voice was older, smooth. Of course, Mr. Lawson. I'm always happy to meet with concerned citizens. I have evidence, Jonathan's voice said. 47 documented bribes, environmental reports with falsified data. You've been planning to build on Meridian without proper remediation. Contamination levels are 20 times higher than your reports claim. If you build there, you'll poison everyone. A pause. When Bishop's voice returned, the facade had cracked. Those are serious accusations, accusations without merit. I have the real soil samples, Jonathan said. Independently tested. I have photographs of your meetings with officials, copies of the payments. I'm taking this to the Post-Gazette. I'm giving you 48 hours to come forward voluntarily. If you don't, I'm going public. Another pause. When Bishop spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Mr. Lawson, you're idealistic. I respect that, but you don't understand how the world works. Pittsburgh is dying, lost 100,000 jobs in the last decade. I'm trying to save it. Bringing investment, development, employment. Yes, there are costs. There are always costs. But a few acceptable risks, a few unfortunate compromises, these are the prices we pay for progress. Those aren't acceptable risks, Jonathan said. Those are people's lives. Bishop's voice turned icy. I've built this city's future, created 20,000 jobs, invested hundreds of millions. And you think a few environmental concerns, a few minor health risks should stop that? You think the lives of a few workers matter more than the survival of an entire city, yes? Jonathan said simply. I do. Then you're a fool, Bishop said. And fools don't survive long. This conversation is over. I'll give you 48 hours to reconsider. Destroy your evidence. Forget this crusade. Because if you don't, if you take this public, you will regret it. I promise you that. Static. Then Jonathan's voice quieter. February 11th, 1996. That was Calvin Bishop. He just threatened me. I need to move faster. Go to the press tomorrow. The tape ended. The silence was absolute. Audrey was crying openly. My father died 2 days after that recording, February 13th. It wasn't a gas leak, Declan said. It was an execution. Bishop gave him 48 hours. Jonathan didn't back down. So Bishop killed him. Garrett thought of Captain Crane, of Dylan Foster. This is the same thing he said quietly. Power protecting power, lives sacrifice for profit. Declan looked at Garrett with understanding. You've seen this before. Garrett nodded. Different names, different place, same story. My friend died because of faulty equipment. The officer made me sign a false report. I did it because I was afraid. He looked at the evidence. Theodore Lawson did the same. Stayed silent. And it destroyed him. I won't make that mistake again. Audrey lowered her hands. What do we do? How do we fight a man who's been doing this for 30 years? We expose him, Declan said firmly. Publicly, completely. So loud, so public, so undeniable that even his connections can't bury it. How, Garrett asked. I know a lawyer, Declan said. Catherine Price. Public interest law, civil rights. Uncorruptible. One of the few attorneys Bishop hasn't bought or intimidated. Will she take this when she sees this evidence? Declan gestured. When she hears that tape, she'll take it pro bono. We need to move fast, Garrett said. Agreed, Declan said. I'll call Catherine now. We meet at her office first thing Monday. Monday, Audrey said. That's 2 days. What do we do until then? We keep this secure, Declan said. And you don't go home. If Bishop's people saw you meet Mr. Hayes, they're watching your apartment. Where do I go? You stay here, Declan said. I've got a secure apartment upstairs. It's not fancy, but it's safe. He turned to Garrett. You and your dog need to disappear completely. Go back to wherever you've been staying. Don't contact anyone. Just wait until Monday morning, then meet us at Catherine's office. Garrett nodded. We'll be there. Declan wrote an address on paper and handed it to Garrett. Catherine Price, attorney at law. This address? 9 a.m. Monday. We won't be late, Garrett promised. As Garrett and Ranger prepared to leave, Audrey stepped forward. She looked at Garrett with profound gratitude. Mr. Hayes, she said softly, thank you. Thank you for not throwing that unit away. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for caring when you have your own troubles. Your father was a good man, Garrett said. He deserves justice. You deserve the truth. Audrey pulled him into a brief, fierce hug. Garrett stiffened, unused to contact, but returned the embrace awkwardly. When she pulled back, she looked at Ranger. And thank you, too. You found what everyone else missed. Ranger's tail wagged once. Garrett and Ranger slipped into the cold afternoon. They took a winding route back to the Meridian Steelworks, Garrett constantly scanning for followers. The streets were quiet, just another freezing February day. When they finally squeezed through the gap in the fence and made their way to the small brick office, Garrett felt relief. He sat on the cold floor, Ranger settling beside him. The dog rested his head on Garrett's lap. 2 more days, boy, Garrett whispered. 2 more days and we finish this. For Jonathan, for Dylan. Outside, wind howled through broken windows. Inside, in a small circle of warmth, Garrett closed his eyes and allowed himself to sleep. The weekend passed slowly. Garrett and Ranger remained hidden, venturing out only once to find food. Declan had offered money, but Garrett refused. He'd survived this long. He could survive 2 more days. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Garrett and Ranger made their way to Catherine Price's office, a brownstone on 5th Avenue with a brass plaque. Catherine Price, attorney at law. Declan and Audrey were already there. Audrey looked exhausted but determined. The woman who greeted them was in her late 40s with sharp blue eyes and graying blonde hair pulled back severely. She wore a tailored gray suit and moved with brisk efficiency. Catherine Price didn't waste time. She listened to the tape 3 times, examined every document, read Theodore's letter twice. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but intense. This is the biggest case of my career, possibly the biggest corruption case in Pittsburgh history, but we have a problem. What problem? Audrey had asked. If we file in court, it'll take months, maybe years. Bishop's lawyers will bury us in motions. And during that time, evidence disappears. Witnesses develop amnesia. People have accidents. Catherine looked at each of them. We need to go public, immediately, so public Bishop can't make it disappear. How? Garrett asked. Catherine smiled without warmth. I know a reporter. Elliot Ross, investigative journalist, won a Pulitzer. He's been looking for a story this big for 10 years. He'll run it front page. But here's the brilliant part. She pulled out her phone. Audrey, your organization has 5,000 followers on Facebook, correct? About that, Audrey confirmed. When Bishop realizes we have this, he'll try to control the narrative. He'll call you, offer money, threaten legal action, maybe offer to meet. We let him think he's in control, but when you meet him, you wear a camera, and we live stream the entire conversation to your 5,000 followers. Declan's eyes lit up. So when he admits to murder, when he threatens her, thousands see it in real time. No way to bury it. Exactly, Catherine said. But Audrey, this is dangerous. If Bishop feels cornered, you could be at serious risk. Audrey's voice was steady. My father died trying to expose this man. I'm not backing down. Catherine nodded. Then let's set the trap. The call came Tuesday afternoon. Garrett was with Audrey in Catherine's conference room when her phone rang. Unknown number. Catherine nodded. Answer it. Speaker. Audrey pressed the button. Hello? The voice was smooth, cultured, with steel underneath. Miss Lawson? This is Calvin Bishop. I believe we need to talk. Garrett's hands clenched. This was the voice from the tape. 30 years older, but unmistakable. About what, Mr. Bishop? I understand you've been asking questions about your father. About his unfortunate accident. I also understand you've come into possession of old documents. Documents that might be misinterpreted. I don't know what you're talking about. A pause. When Bishop spoke again, the friendliness evaporated. Miss Lawson, I'm a reasonable man. I'd like to discuss this privately. Face to face. Perhaps we can reach an understanding. Your daughter Emma is 7 years old, correct? Attends Jefferson Elementary. Audrey's face went white. Are you threatening my child? I'm simply noting that young children are precious, vulnerable. The world is full of unfortunate accidents. I would hate for your family to experience another tragedy. Catherine was writing, say yes, agree to meet. Audrey took a shaky breath. Where and when? My office, Bishop Tower, 40th floor. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Come alone. If I see anyone with you, if I suspect recording devices, this conversation ends and I make one phone call. Do we understand each other? Yes, Audrey whispered. Good. I look forward to our discussion. The line went dead. Audrey immediately started crying. He threatened Emma, my 7-year-old daughter, which is exactly what we needed, Catherine said grimly. That call was recorded. That threat is evidence. Now we live stream and end him. Wednesday, February 18th, 2026, 2 p.m. Garrett stood in the alley behind Bishop Tower with Declan and Ranger. Audrey was upstairs wearing a button camera hidden in her coat. Catherine was in a van monitoring the live stream. The plan was simple. Get Bishop talking. Get him to admit to murder, to bribes, to threatening her family. Broadcast everything live. Garrett watched the live stream on Declan's tablet. The viewer count was climbing. 847, 1,293, 2,156. The camera showed Audrey stepping out of the elevator. A receptionist led her to massive double doors. Calvin Bishop, chairman. The doors opened. Calvin Bishop stood behind a desk the size of a small car. 80 years old, but still tall, still commanding. White hair, ice blue eyes, charcoal suit that cost more than Garrett earned in a year as sergeant. Miss Lawson, please sit. Audrey sat. The camera showed Bishop walking around his desk, standing over her. You have something that belongs to me, Bishop said. Documents, recordings. I want them back. They don't belong to you. They belong to my father. Bishop's smile was cold. Your father was going to destroy this city's future with naive environmentalism. I offered him partnership. He refused. He chose confrontation over cooperation. He chose truth over corruption. Truth. Bishop laughed. Truth is a luxury, Miss Lawson. I've built this city, created 30,000 jobs. Invested billions. Your father wanted to stop all that over soil contamination that might possibly cause health issues decades down the line. Do you understand the mathematics? 30,000 Ross versus a few potential cancer cases? The calculus is simple. You murdered him, Audrey said, voice shaking. On the tablet, Garrett saw the viewer count 8,492. Bishop's expression didn't change. I eliminated an obstacle. Your father had 48 hours to see reason. He chose martyrdom. That was his decision. You're admitting it. To you privately, yes, Bishop said, because you're going to give me those documents, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and take a very generous settlement. $10 million. Enough to never work again, enough to send your daughter to any university. All you have to do is stay silent, just like your coward Uncle Theodore did for 30 years. The office door burst open. Preston Bishop, Calvin's grandson, stood in the doorway, face pale, phone in hand. Grandfather, he said, voice shaking. What are you doing? Calvin turned annoyed. Preston, I'm in a meeting. You just confessed to murder, Preston. Held up his phone showing the live stream. 12,000 people are watching this right now. The comments are exploding. People are calling the police. Calvin's face went white. He spun toward Audrey. You're streaming this. Audrey stood backing toward the door. Everyone needed to know the truth. Calvin's calm shattered. He lunged toward Audrey. In the alley, Garrett was already moving. Go now. He burst through the service entrance, Ranger at his heels. Declan right behind. They hit the stairwell, taking steps 3 at a time, Garrett's knees screaming. On the 40th floor, Calvin had grabbed Audrey's arm, but before he could do more, the door slammed open. Silas Morgan Bishop's head of security rushed in. Sir, we need to contain this. That live stream, he stopped when he saw Audrey. His hand moved toward his jacket, and that's when Ranger arrived. The German Shepherd burst through the door, 85 pounds of trained military working dog with one objective, protect. Ranger didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply attacked. He hit Silas, low teeth clamping onto the man's leg, pulling him off balance. Silas went down hard, screaming. Garrett grabbed Audrey, pulling her toward the door. Move, Calvin Bishop stood frozen, watching his world collapse on a phone screen. The live stream had 15,000 viewers. Comments flooded with outrage. Sirens wailed outside. Declan appeared, his own phone out, filming. Calvin Bishop, I'm Declan Hayes, former FBI. Stay exactly where you are. Police burst in 60 seconds later. The live stream reached 18,000 viewers by the time they handcuffed Calvin Bishop and read him his rights. The story broke nationally within hours. By evening, it was lead on every news channel. Bishop Corporation's stock entered freefall. The mayor called for emergency investigation. The FBI announced they were opening a case. And Garrett Hayes, standing in the crowd outside Bishop Tower, with Ranger at his side, felt something he hadn't felt in 11 years. Peace. 6 months later, the Meridian Steelworks was unrecognizable. Dangerous sections had been demolished, but strong brick foundations remained. Construction crews swarmed the property building, something new from the bones of the old. Garrett Hayes stood at the window of his office watching the progress. The office had once been the cold security room where he'd slept on concrete. Now it had drywall, fresh paint, heat, and a desk with blueprints. He wore a clean navy work shirt with a small embroidered patch, Meridian Community Project, Security Director. Behind him, Ranger dozed on a dog bed, gray muzzle resting on paws. The dog's coat was thick and healthy, regularly groomed, well-fed. Content. A knock at the door. Garrett, you ready? Ari Lawson stepped in, wearing a professional dress, carrying a folder. She looked different than 6 months ago. The fear was gone, replaced by quiet confidence. The dedication ceremony starts in 20 minutes, she said. You should put on the jacket. Garrett picked up the navy blazer hanging on his chair. It felt strange wearing professional clothes after so many years in rags, but he was learning. They walked together through the construction site. Workers called out greetings. Hey, Mr. Hayes. Looking sharp, boss. The ceremony was held in what would become the community center. A crowd of maybe 200 had gathered. City officials, donors, families of the 7 victims, reporters. A large banner hung on the wall. Jonathan Lawson Memorial Community Center. Affordable housing and veteran services. Calvin Bishop had been convicted of 7 counts of murder and 43 counts of bribery. He was serving life without parole. Preston Bishop had taken over Bishop Corporation and pledged $50 million to clean up contaminated sites, starting with Meridian. The settlement for victims' families had been substantial. Audrey used her portion to fund this project, her father's dream finally realized. She stepped to the podium. 30 years ago, my father bought this land with a vision. He believed poisoned ground could be healed, that communities could be rebuilt. That doing the right thing mattered more than doing the profitable thing. Her voice caught. He was murdered for that belief, murdered and slandered and nearly forgotten. But he left behind evidence, and he left behind a brother who, despite his fear, made sure that evidence survived. And 6 months ago, that evidence found its way to a homeless veteran and his dog who did something my uncle couldn't. They fought back. She looked at Garrett. Garrett Hayes could have thrown away a storage unit full of junk, could have ignored a 30-year-old mystery, could have stayed invisible and safe. Instead, he risked everything to bring truth to light. Not because he knew my father, not because he expected reward, but because he understood what it meant to fail someone you cared about, and he refused to fail again. The crowd applauded. So today we're not just opening a community center, we're keeping a promise. My father's promise to this community, my uncle's promise to his conscience, and Garrett's promise to his friend Dylan Foster and to everyone who's been silenced by power and corruption. More applause. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, Garrett stood looking at the photograph mounted on the wall. Jonathan Lawson holding young Audrey, both laughing. "He'd be proud of you," a voice said. Garrett turned. Audrey stood beside him, tears in her eyes. "I hope so," Garrett said quietly. "I know so." She squeezed his arm. "You gave me my father back. Not the man, but his legacy, his truth, his honor. That's worth more than anything." Ranger patted over and Audrey knelt to scratch his ears. "And you, good boy, you're the real hero." Ranger's tail wagged slow and contented. That evening, Garrett and Ranger walked along the bank of the Allegheny River. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and purple. The air was warm, August now, and Pittsburgh was beautiful. Garrett had an apartment on the second floor of the renovated building. 2 rooms, small but clean. Heat that worked. A refrigerator full of food. A bed that didn't hurt his back. He had a salary of $75,000 a year. He had purpose. And sitting beside him, tongue lolling in the warm evening air, was Ranger, not just a companion, but the dog who had found hidden truth when everyone else saw only garbage. "You know what I think," Boy Garrett said, watching sunset reflect off the river. Ranger looked up with intelligent amber eyes. "I think we were meant to find that storage unit. I think Theodore's prayer was answered. Not by some stranger looking for treasure, but by 2 broken soldiers who understood what it meant to fail and needed a chance to do better." Ranger's tail thumped against grass. Garrett smiled, genuine, the first real smile he'd felt in years. "We did good, didn't we?" One more thump. "Yeah, we did." They sat together in fading light, a man who had found his way back from despair, and a dog who had never stopped believing in him, watching the city they had helped heal settle into evening peace. And somewhere in whatever place good men go after death, Dylan Foster and Jonathan Lawson stood together and smiled. The mission was complete.